good early morning or good evening, because we have some global participation across quite a number of time zones. But welcome to this particular concurrent session, which is on leadership development partnerships. And we do have two distinguished panelists. We have Dr. Marcia Socikwa, who is the Deputy Director General in the Department of Higher Education and Training, and she is the key Deputy Director General for us, for our sector, because her branch or portfolio is university education. And of course, we have strong support and vision from the department in terms of their partnership with University South Africa, and HELM being part of University South Africa, taking on the role of leadership and management development, specifically customized.
Recording in progress.
We also have Professor Mthombeni. He is the Dean of GIBS. For the uninitiated, GIBS is the Gordon Institute of Business, which also on the rankings, whether you believe them or not, GIBS is ranked as the top business school in South Africa and I believe in Africa. Now, my speaker instructions tell me that I have to lay the table and set the parameters. I'm not quite sure whether I'm fully capable of encompassing what my colleagues are going to present, but I will just share a PowerPoint that let me just go to from current slide. Is my PowerPoint visible? Is it shared? Nope, it is not shared. I can see that it's not being currently shared. Let me just try that again. Okay, I think we have better luck this time in terms of sharing the PowerPoint. And I'm just going to talk about this, make a small case for why leadership development partnerships, which is our topic and theme, is so relevant to this specific activity, especially in the complex, we've spoken a lot about it, the complexity of the 21st century environment, the disruptive, the chaotic environment, the need for extremely nuanced, subtle strategies. And within that environment, it does become harder and harder for any organization to have the capacity to do everything, or maybe to do a lot of specific things simply on their own. So in that context, networking, partnerships structured in all kinds of different ways, thought leadership partnerships, operational partnerships, resource sharing partnerships become particularly relevant. Now, I'm just going to draw on some research that I did a few years ago, which was in terms of looking at leadership development, trying to build a model for the public sector. I suppose universities are part of the public sector, which we went on a mission to find out when people talk about leadership development or leadership capacity development, what do they actually mean? And we asked a lot of people in various organizations who, whether it was the head of HR or the head of the leadership unit, what they actually meant by that. And very briefly, I'll just go through how we grouped those responses. a lot of people said they do leadership development, and what they really meant was management skills, which I think is fair enough. Management skills and competencies allow individuals to act as more confident and consummate institutional leaders, because we're talking about institutional leadership here, not political leadership or community leadership. So enhancing management competency, improving management skills can be part and parcel of a menu or buffet of what goes into leadership capacity development. We also got the answer of managing differently, to get people to manage less hierarchically and in a more enlightened way. And that needs one to foster significant, more progressive management styles. And we also got, when people said management development, they talked about sending people on programs, academic qualification, professional development programs, with an understanding that formal knowledge also assists in leadership development. We called those the embedded aspects of leadership development. And as I think you're already seeing, many of these things could not be accomplished without requisite strategic and maybe even at times tactical partnerships. So we're looking at what we call the ethothetic aspects of leadership capacity. And there we came across self-discovery, making people more knowledgeable about themselves, which can be facilitated in various ways. Ethical fortitude, becoming more professional, more ethical, more aware of codes of conduct, etc. And also what we call the environmental socialization, not meaning climate change, but meaning the strategic environment and the institutional ethos as a crucial determinant of leadership, and developing that institutional environment along with the values, the mores, along with individual development. And then we spoke about the innovative aspects of leadership. That came up several times. People spoke about broadening horizons, allowing people to travel, to go on secondments, to see how things are done in other jurisdictions, other countries, other continents, how to see that there are different possibilities in the way things may be done. Tacit knowledge, which is finding ways of surfacing, giving vocabulary, and allowing for sharing for the experiential knowledge that a lot of people, most people have, or who are being developed as leaders and managers. And lastly, what we call chaos acculturation, which is to make people resilient and able to cope with the chaos, which maybe is a code word for how we experience complexity in real time, both in terms of intra-institutional, inter-institutional relationships to the environment, and the kind of changes and organizational development that most institutions, including universities, need to undergo to stay apace of becoming 21st century relevant, possibly digital universities, contributing, surviving, prospering in the global digital knowledge economy, and associated factors like the fourth industrial revolution. So there is it very briefly displayed as a kind of a periodic table of management development or leadership development elements. And as one can see, one can pick and choose, or one can create any kind of leadership development program by appropriately selecting which elements you would like to include, how you would like to weight those elements. But again, demonstrating that it might be very difficult to do that by yourself, even if, like GIBS or like HELM, your main mission might be management and leadership development. So broadly speaking, that's just the leadership development triangle, which represents those various aspects and shows you that management development may be more complex than simply imbuing a set of given skills that have been identified, but involves aspects of ethos, of ethics, of environmental scanning, of strategic understanding, of resilience, of formal knowledge, and of process leadership knowledge, among other things. So I think in that sense, what it provides a context to the fact that HELM has a well-established partnership with the Department of Higher Education and Training, who have mandated and who support particular tasks relating to capacitating the university sector. At this point, it's the public universities, but in the future that could change because the growing private university sector in South Africa also faces many similar management leadership challenges. And it also gives a context and a background in terms of this multi-leveled, multifaceted aspect of management leadership development in this postmodern, complex 21st century environment, why HELM has recently entered into an agreement and a work process with GIBS, where we will be working together with them, drawing on their experience, their expertise, and their variety of potential programs in terms of management development and understanding how those can be, that knowledge can be customized and applied to the university sector in a way that will give us effective, optimal, developmental, resilient, sustainable 21st century universities who will be capable of carrying out the complex mandate of universities in South Africa and elsewhere as we see the world today, which goes beyond the mere teaching, learning, and research and community engagement of the past, but now involves aspects of innovation, building critical citizenship, societal leadership, adaptation to the digital economy, providing even moral and social leadership due to political failure, which is common in this environment. I'll leave it at that, and I'll go initially to maybe look at the bigger picture first. So I'll call upon Dr. Socikwa, Dr. Marcia Socikwa, if you could ascend the electronic rostrum and give us your contribution.
Prof. FitzGerald, I think let the other colleagues go first, please, and then I'll come in last. Thank you so much.
Okay, we'll do it the other way around. We'll move from the particular to the general. I wouldn't say the micro, probably the meso level. So Prof. Morris Mthombeni, I think you are ready, willing, and able. I will yield the electronic rostrum to you. Please share your screen and take us away.
So
yes,
my name is Morris Mthombeni, and as Patrick indicated, I'm the Dean here at the Gordon Institute of Business Science. And for those that are not familiar with us, we are the business school of the University of Pretoria. We're very proud of this because we're a public institution, and oftentimes people that engage with us aren't familiar with the fact that we are part of a public institution. And I think as a public institution, oftentimes in our country, we look at the parts of public institutions that are not working and seek to generalize a picture of institutional decay, when there are many, many other institutions that are working that seek to counterbalance that. And of course, it's not to underplay the notion of the challenges that we face as a country, but ready to kind of create a juxtaposition and hopefully encourage a more balanced view, and also hopefully encourage a way of seeing the world that is helpful as opposed to that is hopeful as opposed to that is hurtful. Thank you, Patrick, for inviting us to be part of this conversation. And I want to lean onto one or two words that you mentioned. So the word of complexity. We live in a world of complexity. And I must say, when I travel, and I do quite a bit of that in the rest of the world, I remember way back when, about 5 years ago, when you were thinking about this idea of complexity, this was the domain of countries like ours, developing economies, or what the West calls emerging markets. But now, 5 years later, when you travel in the world and you listen to what is on the top of the agenda, whether it's policymakers, whether it's academics or it's business people, everyone, everywhere, is this idea of complexity. And all of us are living in a world of complexity. The difference is, for many parts of the world, certainly the so-called developed worlds, dealing in complexity is a novelty. Whereas for parts of the world where many of us are located on the continent and other related parts of the world, dealing with complexity is a way of life. And so when I reflect on that, I was thinking, what does it take then to live in this complex world and to navigate leadership and management in this complex world? Three C's come to mind. The first one is courage. And I think those of you that are in leadership and management in the education sector, especially in the higher education sector, you know that we all have to have courage in order to survive and thrive in the sector. And the second word, and also this word, I suppose, was seeded to us during the period of the Fees Must Fall, but certainly brought to life in the COVID pandemic that we are now slowly emerging out of, is this word of care. And gone are the days when the professor used to throttle the students, and you want to make sure that they're resilient and robust. We still want to make them resilient, but we do so using different mechanisms. And so when we talk about concepts of leadership and management, particularly in higher education, we think a lot more needs to be said and done for this notion of care. And ultimately, the idea of compassion. Of course, we know we are dealing in an environment with a wide distribution of inequality in terms of young people or old, depending on who's learning, who either are very privileged or extremely underprivileged. And certainly for people like us, our job is to make sure we give everybody the opportunity to realize their educational dreams, because through realizing their educational dreams, we give them hope and an opportunity to realize their life dreams. So those 3 C's, Patrick, are the first 3s that I think for me made it possible for GIBS in any event to put their hand up in its aspiration to partner with HELM, and in partnering with HELM, hopefully to partner with the entire ecosystem of higher education in exploring important topics of leadership and management. So with that in mind as a framing construct, you've taught me a few words, and another new word, ethothetic or ethotetic. I'd never heard of that word before, so thank you, Prof. FitzGerald. I've learned a new word. And so I'm going to build on that concept of ethotetic, specifically the environmental side. Unlike you, I do believe in COP27. I do believe in SDGs. I know I'm kidding. So I believe in all the forms of environment, but in this context, let me begin with this idea of the university of the future. I believe that HELM sits at the intersection of helping universities to determine where they belong. Whether you are a bureaucratic university And as a bureaucratic university, you seek to embrace stability. Or as Professor Burton Clark introduced us a while ago to this notion of an entrepreneurial university. And in this entrepreneurial university, and I'm happy to share some comments around this later on, you embrace uncertainty. And of course, the idea of uncertainty was very big into the 90s and early 2000s, but we later learned that actually it's not just about uncertainty, but it's about change. And so Professor Barbara Sporn then introduces us this concept of an adaptive university, which incorporates these notions of entrepreneurial, but actually is a lot closer to the kind of university that is called for today, the university that is caring, the university that is compassionate, and the university that has courage. And whether you're talking in my field, in the business school community, we know that we remain challenged to demonstrate that we know what these words mean, or in the broader field of higher education, we know that the broader leadership remains challenged to demonstrate that it is awake to these concepts of adaptive university. Beyond adaptive university, I come from the field of strategy as a professor, and one of the theories that I feel is so appropriate for the environment we live in is this concept of dynamic capabilities, the concept that underpins the notion of what resources do you have inside your organization? What resources do you have in your universities? What capabilities do you have? How distinguishing are these capabilities? And more importantly, are these capabilities a source of inertia or a source of growth? And so the dynamic capabilities talks about the idea of universities that embrace learning, not as a product, but as a process, learning as a way of life, universities that embrace appropriate levels of failure and learn from those failings. And I think given that many university construct is measured by success and throughputs and all of these kinds of things, we often forget that we're not about throughputs and pass rates. We're actually about learning, and learning really talks about also unlearning those things that are not helpful and learning new things that are going to help us to be more resilient, to be more adaptive, to be more entrepreneurial, and to find spaces of stability, but without being beholden to those aspects of stability. So within that context, these are some of the things that between GIBS and HELM will help higher education leaders to embrace, to explore, to engage on, and will bring local and international academics across many fields who help us to kind of reimagine the university of the future and create a path about how do we move from bureaucratic to entrepreneurial to adaptive to dynamic, or how do we leapfrog from bureaucratic all the way to dynamic, if that is our aspiration. And maybe to kind of bring it in terms of the strategic approach of us doing this, is that we are interested in three processes of context, process, and content. And then when we engage with leaders, we say within this approach of thinking about higher education, you need to understand the socioeconomic and academic conditions in which you operate. You need to understand issues of funding, competition, regulation, counterbalance these with your inner beliefs, resources, power politics. And we've seen institutions that struggle with the inner dimensions and they don't seem to be awake to the challenges of the outer dimensions. Taking these into consideration, you then are interested in how do you go about the processes of setting up your vision, direction, and intent. How do you go about communicating this? How do you align the entire stakeholder community in your university? And how do you ensure that you are managing appropriate performance measures? To do that, then we help people to think about what ideas go into the content, i.e. the strategic initiatives, their capabilities, and the service activities that you need to be engaged with. And ultimately, I think what's going to come out, Patrick, out of our partnership with HELM is that we should have what I call more attuned leaders in the higher education system. And these are leaders that are self-attuned and emotion intelligent, because if you lack emotional intelligence, you have no business leading other people. You first have to learn to self-regulate in order so that you can regulate others. We know that this is what to teach younger children. We teach them at primary school, and yet somehow later on in life we'll forget these. And so we need to have the adults in the room to stand up so that we can make sure that the higher education sector is stable and is dynamic and is resilient. We need leaders that are attuned to the needs and aspirations of our followers, because as leaders, we're in service. We're not there to dictate. We're there to serve the community. And we need leaders that are ethically attuned and morally centered, which means we need leaders that understand issues of governance, as opposed to leaders that flout issues of governance. And ultimately, we need leaders that are attuned to history, to the present, and to the future, because if you don't know where you come from, anywhere will do, as Alice in Wonderland, the Church of Shaket said to Alice in Wonderland. And so for us, we think we'll help leaders to ground their leadership capability in a deeper contextual understanding. I suppose I can stop there and say, let's enjoy the engagement, Patrick. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks a lot, Morris. I think you managed to put quite a lot on a big buffet on the table in quite a brief presentation. But before we go to Dr. Socikwa, I do have a small confession to make. Ethothetic is a neologism which I created because when we did the research, I was convinced that there would be an English word, an adjective, that would collectively describe identified issues and concepts relating to ethos and ethics. And indeed, I could not find one. So I made up the word ethothetic in my defense. In the journal article that appears, there is a footnote to say that it's a neologism. And I also followed the rules by which English derives certain conceptual words from the ancient Greek. So every year when these dictionaries, Oxford English and Chambers, announce new words that have come into the language, I read that article in the great hope that one day I'm going to see ethothetic
Listen, if your name was Trump, all you have to say is Bigley, and the word appears in the dictionaries. Sadly, your name is not Trump.
Isn't it terrible? So I also I think I appreciated your reference to Burton Clark. I mean, as you rightly said, Burton Clark's influence was more direct in the latter part of the 20th century, but I believe he is a seminal thinker that bridged us from a kind of fairly sterile managerialist debate, you know, the academe versus the well-managed university. And I think he took us into a post-managerialist world, in that his work shows that an entrepreneurial university is dependent on a quality, academically free, critical academe, and that innovation does not come out of a sort of deadening down of academic quality, but in fact the opposite. So for me, and I think for many others, I think he showed us the path to where we are now, where it's a question of how you balance, reconcile, synergize all these different aspects of the university. We're about to go to government. One very graphic image about the 21st century university is that it's three organizations, which is organizations in inverted commas, but it's three sort of major missions inside a single legal persona and inside a single set of structure and systems. So university is one, the academe, and it still bears the marks, the genes and memes of a self-governing community of scholars. And that is still alive, but a university is also a government agency, especially a government university. It's in receipt of taxpayers' money. and it takes that money and therefore takes upon itself certain duties of educating a new generation of professionals, intellectuals, of doing strategic and applied research of use to the society, of partnering with relevant institutions to encourage innovation and so on. And then the third, and perhaps the Burton Clark seminal moment, is the university in the 21st century is also at the same time a business. So we have to crack how the university can be all three organizations, but I find it a useful metaphor because in council and Senate meetings, I often found people arguing because they were paradigmatically using language differently. And if they had just said, from the point of view of the university as the academe, this would be what we should do. As a government agency, we need to bolster this, we need to improve our performance here. And as a business, here are the sort of innovations we can introduce and how we can get all those three. And it's metaphorical, it's heuristic, it's not literal, but it's just a way of imagining and imagineering how all these different mandates of a university can come together.
But this is where the partnerships then work, Patrick, in that those people that go through the same learning experience around languaging and framing then have a shortcut, a shorthand to be able to have those conversations when they're back in the office, and they eliminate unnecessary misunderstandings. You build appropriate tolerance, care, compassion, so that you can have those courageous conversations.
I agree with you about language, and I like the term attuned, because a half-attuned university leader is going to give you mediocre leadership, which is not going to assist in our current complex and rigorous challenges that we face socially, economically, access-wise. And a non-attuned leader is going to give us toxic leadership. And sadly, we have seen a little bit of that in the sector. I know HELM in the medium to long term, we're trying to eliminate as much as that as possible. Marcia, Dr. Socikwa, can we bring you in?
Yes, I've been enjoying the discourse, and you must say you do have the luxury as academics to mull and digest all of these. I'm not sure. Can you see me? Can you hear me?
You're no longer an academic, but the camera is just showing us the top of your head.
Oh, there, right. Is that better? Okay, right.
Much better, much better. Even a little fraction more, if you can.
All right.
That's perfect. That's absolutely
right.
perfect. Right.
I cannot see a thing on my side, so I'll proceed.
You're fine now.
Thank you, Prof. I've really been enjoying the discussion, and I'm still an academic in my own way. I think, if you are once immersed, always immersed. And I particularly miss the research and writing quite a bit, but more the research. And I always say the beauty about the academe is you are paid to think. Isn't it wonderful? Paid to think. Very, very few people have that luxury, or let me say very few professions have that latitude to be paid to think. I must say, I agree completely with all the sentiments expressed in our little room thus far. I, in fact, cannot find any point of contestation. I'd like to reflect more on, not so much so on what leadership is, what management is. I'd like to perhaps reflect on what, from where I'm sitting in government, what we are expecting. And I'll start off by saying, everyone thinks all we do is look at compliance with legislation, the regulations, the multiple regulations that we develop, and reporting and so forth. And I want to just give you comfort, it's far more than that. When we look at the data we are receiving, we are increasingly moving towards data mining. And in mining that data, we want to ensure the best possible future for our students. And so if our focus is students, it means we want to look at the entire ecosystem. Do we have leaders in place who are cognizant of supporting that ecosystem? Starting from the day the student arrives, is the ambience, do we take care of the conditions our students live in? Does it matter to us as leaders? At a second level, are they encouraged? Do we provide that propulsion, to learning? Or are we, viewing our students as part of the cattle that have come into our spaces of learning, and we can't wait for them to go? And then we conclude amongst ourselves who is worth the energy, and that is our energy, and who is not worth our energy. So I will definitely say my biggest concern is, are our institutions preparing our students for the future? And is this future that is so far, yet so near, part of our daily thinking? And I've been reading a book by Clem Santa. I don't know if you've heard of it, Prof, but it's his new book is Thinking the Future. And he makes, I think, a very pertinent point, and I think it's important that I read it. Open quote, all our decisions are about the future, whether it is tomorrow, next year, or next decade. Yet our choices are often undermined by desires, by expectations, and common mental mistakes. Making assumptions, worrying about things we can't control, missing signals because we are distracted by the noise. But if you can learn how to think, you can learn how to look ahead. And I close quote. So our preoccupation with preparing our students for the future, and we must acknowledge a very complex future, as you indicated earlier, a future that does not necessarily provide for current careers, does not accommodate existing curricula, does not accommodate our immediate focus, which is resolving our current problems. And it's certainly what I believe, a future that has problems that are definitely more compounded than what they currently are. And if universities can start tackling that question, I think they'll be assisting us a great deal. Thus far, and I must share this with you, one of my key projects is looking at, and I'll be setting up a team on whether our curriculum is fully cognizant of the future that we cannot see. Does it make provision for that future. And I just want to use this as an example. During COVID, we suddenly discovered that we may not need pilots to the same extent as we used to in the past, when we have automated machines, currently in the form of drones, very sophisticated drones, driving themselves. So all our investments in the pilot of yesterday may need to be reconfigured. And as you know, Prof, we, as a department, very deliberately set aside funds to ensure that the generations that are sitting within the different institutions are able to adapt. And so we will be doing far more monitoring and evaluation going forward of all the programs, particularly the UCTB programs. I've advised the team that we, particularly come 2023, we will not be in a hurry to allocate funds without understanding the impact of those funds. Are they yielding the kind of outcomes we had anticipated they would? Are we ensuring that the funds, for example, that we give to HELM are yielding leaders who are able to support some of our imperatives? And I've mentioned the one, that is the curriculum appropriate and relevant curriculum. The other one is when we look at the funding model, how are leaders using their funds as efficiently as possible? So not just a matter of ensuring that our universities are fit for purpose, but are they really paying attention to the inefficiencies that we, and I mean all of us as taxpayers, are cross-subsidizing in one way or another? So that would be something we'd be looking at in the funding model, in the fee framework, and it is a matter of great concern, because there are really instances where universities could manage better. And I want to go back to the issue of, say, fleet management. Whenever I travel, and this is since I've entered the department, I am absolutely astounded by the number of university vehicles that are all over the roads, and in most instances empty. And you then questioning yourself and saying, we are funding all of these vehicles, and you're not too certain if there's someone who is monitoring that the use and cost of that particular asset. So yes, we will be having a number of questions, but they all evolve from and it's not because, to go back to it, it's not because we want to reconfigure universities into the 4 categories that I think Professor Morris Mthombeni mentioned earlier. That is the entrepreneurial or bureaucratic or adaptive or dynamic university. I'm not sure if any of those 1 quadrants provide for what we need to focus on. Obviously, given the question of sustainability, we're having less and less funds, and how we use those funds, every single rand is beginning to matter more and more, particularly given that our enrollment numbers cannot decrease. They can only increase. And as we consider that level of expansion, it means we've got to ensure that the rand covers, every rand we have covers more students. And more students are then able to emerge and find employment. And if we cannot do that, then we, in my own view, then we are really betraying generations to come, because you cannot acquire your certificate and then sit at home for days and years on end. So those are some of the things we'll be looking at. And so tracer studies are also going to center as part of our priorities, so that we understand when the students emerge from the institutions, what happens to them? Does the system care for them, support them, ensure that they can use those certificates as and improve the economic and social conditions of their families? So the entire ecosystem is something that one will be paying greater attention to, beyond the comfort of the academic space. And I'll stop there. Thank you very much, Prof.
Right. I think you put a whole lot of points on the table. Not to forget, you spoke about the future, and I think that's very relevant. It seems a very generic and maybe philosophical term, but in the 20th century, in the modern era, the future seemed further away and maybe more predictable, and there was this industrial optimism that we were all marching in lockstep to some more prosperous, more enlightened world where everybody would have food, human rights, democracy, technology would solve all our problems. And that's not what happened. We live in some sort of post-truth era where some people are even highly skeptical of expertise, of knowledge. There's political instability, assaults on democracy, disruptive post-industrial technologies have torn apart the certainties of the previous modes of production. And the future is a lot more in our faces. It's very close to us. And I think we have this much greater sense that our decisions, as you say, are in fact forming the future. If we look at the universities now, the digitalization of pedagogy and organizations, there was the old normal pre-COVID. Post-COVID, there's some new normal which is not going to be the old normal for universities, and we are creating it, but we don't actually know what it is. It's going to take a lot of leadership as well as management, but leadership to find pathways within this complexity. I also liked what you said about government not just being compliance. I worked in government before I went to the university sector as a public service commissioner and as a director general. And I came to universities finding, sometimes we think apartheid is very far away, and sometimes the memes and genes are still with us, a kind of resistance to working with government and governmental agencies, or a reluctance or slowness, even when there were huge opportunities of funding, sharing of knowledge. Obviously, universities need to be critical of government. That's one of the things they do. But it doesn't mean that they can't simultaneously work with them. And it's very shocking sometimes for South Africans to visit these universities that they have held up as these great examples of academic freedom and, autonomy, to go to an Oxford and to go to a Harvard, and then to understand how closely interlinked and how many different levels of cooperative partnerships with various government departments, federal, state, government agencies, a revolving door of personnel, applied research being carried out by universities to solve certain wicked problems government is facing. And I think we have to work harder on both sides, not to, have some mechanical formality of respect where we bow to each other, but to actually realize we're part of the same development project, and that government, whichever party is in power or coalition of parties or whatever, has a duty to work with universities. Universities have opportunities and duties to cooperate and partner with government in terms of taking us forward. There used to be the vocabulary of the triple helix. I think we abandoned the vocabulary prematurely in South Africa because we still haven't got that triple helix, that dynamic of innovation between the public sector, universities, and the private sector, with intellectual partnerships, practice partnerships, different kinds of funding, and particular agreed missions for that kind of joint entrepreneurialism. Morris, maybe time for you to come in here. There are a few questions emerging on the chat, and I'll put them to our panelists in a moment.
Thank you. So could I engage with Dr. Socikwa's one or two comments? And can I call you Marcia, Doctor? I prefer first name basis, if that's okay. Otherwise, I'll stick to Dr. Socikwa.
That's fine. That's fine.
Thank you, Marcia.
It is the HELM convention.
I didn't want to be too familiar. I think part of the challenge in leadership, whether it's in business, certainly in the university system, is to focus too much into the future without having a deep understanding about our past. And also assuming there's a single past when there are many pasts. And part of the challenge for me that I would like us to be in conversation, and certainly we do this with our students, is to make sure that as a leader, know the pasts that are in the room and develop a level of empathy for those pasts, because those pasts are shaping your current reality. And ignoring those pasts means that you are building the future on a weak foundation. So again, the idea of the future, Patrick, you talk about the future being near. In fact, I would propose that we are dealing in many futures as opposed to a single point in the future. And there are multiple paths to these futures. And as we make choices, we open certain paths and we close other paths. And it's this understanding that the future is being created as we speak in the choices that we make. And even non-choices are a form of future. I think so for me, kind of this dynamic of the past, present, and future is really important for leaders to keep in mind. And it helps us to develop humility, respect, and a collegiality that is really important for us to be leaders in society. And then again, when I think about the challenges that Marcia mentions around what are the skills that we should be investing in respect of our students, and who are these students? Are they products, or are they important part of the ecosystem that enables us to achieve an important social agenda, an important academic agenda? Firstly, in my view, anyone who thinks of students as a product is making a mistake. The students are part of the conversation and a part of the result and the ingredients of what is important in building that future. And often people, those that don't think in historical terms, won't know words by people like Hendrik Verwoerd when he was in charge of Bantu affairs. And in one of his speeches says, incidentally, let's mention he was professor Hendrik Verwoerd, because he got his PhD at age 26, becomes a professor in Stellenbosch. When he says, I will develop an education system that will keep the black child, the black man, didn't say woman, but it's implied, inferior to the white men for 1,000 years. And in doing so, removes the ability for the black man to engage with the kind of knowledge that we need in science, in the STEM subjects, in the mathematics, and so forth. And today we are paying for that policy all those years later, even though he is no longer with us. We have a small country called Taiwan with about 24 million people that generates more than 90% of the microchips that are used in high-end technologies that are driving the future, that are driving the present and driving the future. 24 million people on an island, they've got no other resources. There are no mineral resources in Thailand, right? All they have is their education system and their fear of China, of course, and their determination and some amazing policies and amazing leaders who drive. Of course, the friendship of the Americas doesn't hurt. And yet they are a pivotal part of the future of the world. With all of our mineral resources in South Africa, all of our mineral resources on the continent, we continue to be sitting at the back of the bus, if we are on the bus at all. So again, for me, I would encourage leaders, we need a historical perspective to our conversations so that we challenge the system to say, I would say that we need every student to do math at the minimum, right? Ideally math and science, and we must invest deeply in this. So Marcia, if we want to really kind of say what skills do we need, in addition to all the humane skills that we do have, and we're very good at that, we know how to deal with diversity, equity, and inclusion, but we don't know how to do the new language of the present and the language of the futures, which is the languages of ones and zeros. And you've got smaller countries that are defeating us in this regard. And I invite the leaders in higher education to reflect on how much are we investing to make sure that more and more of our children, more and more of our students are encouraged to fall in love with ones and zeros, not as consumers of the products of ones and zeros, but as the creators of the products of ones and zeros. Thank you, Patrick.
Okay, I'm going to try to weave in some of the questions so we can appreciate what some of our participants are thinking about. The first one has come to me in the following form. To what extent does the modern university, well, we've got a problem right there because modernity ended around about the 1980s, early 1990s. We're no longer living in the modern era, but we're living in a postmodern era. So it may be a problem that we're putting our finger on, that we actually have modern universities trying to be productive and optimally engage in postmodern conditions. But perhaps if I can rephrase it as to what extent does the contemporary university need to become an enabling pipeline for influential research, from influential research to societal beneficiation. I note that it's societal as not merely economic, which is good, to entrepreneurial commercialization. Yes, it's very challenging. A lot of universities globally have set up specific university companies. A number of South African universities have them, specifically for the commercialization of intellectual property. Globally, something like 96 to 97% of these university companies lose money. Around 1%, more or less split even. I was chair of the board of its enterprises, and we sort of split even, which puts us in that weird 1%. Everybody wants to be Cambridge or MIT, who spun off companies where the university retained a small equity portion, and now as minority shareholders, they are raking in tremendous dividends as long as that company is profitable. So what do we think about that? And that is a question of partnerships, and that directly comes out of the problematic of the triple helix. The second question that we can maybe look at is, given the high employment rate, should we be looking at the entrepreneurial degree? I'm understanding that to be a degree in entrepreneurialism rather than a random course here and there. So I guess the questioner is implying that entrepreneurialism should be embedded in the knowledge and processes that are being conveyed. I think a number of programs in universities I'm familiar with would claim that they're doing that already. That may or may not be the case, or it may or may not be effective, but I'll put it to our panelists. Marcia, what do you think?
Thank you very much for the question, Prof. In fact, we are investing extensively in entrepreneurial work in universities. Just yesterday, we were meeting with the British High Commission and thanking them for the extensive funds they direct to us so that we can direct to the universities. And we are constantly looking at other international partnerships. There are many that we've lined up. I will not speak to great detail about them now, but it's precisely because we are excited about the potential that is embedded in this effort. I know, for example, tomorrow we'll be awarding students who have won their where they've competed. I think there are different categories. So different students have won these different categories, and I'll be attending that tomorrow. Our minister attended the awards where the one student, for example, came up with an interesting app to support other students who could not access funds to pay their fees. And so that app supports crowdfunding. So all of these innovations, and I'm particularly excited that this young lady was able to do this and generate income from it. And that income she then used for to further her studies. So all of these opportunities, and that's why I made the point earlier on. If you have an ecosystem in mind, and you are able to support various components of the ecosystem, understanding that each has its different needs and each has a contribution to make. I want to come to the emphasis on science. And I'm a huge advocate for science in every single way. Science helps us to live, but let me not go there. What I wanted to say was, as you view the ecosystem, there are other disciplines that support science directly or indirectly. And one has to look, for example, at the level of the creativity disciplines and how they facilitate or stimulate innovation. Every manager will be taught Management 101. If you want the best in your workforce, do not create conditions that obliterate creativity. Ensure that you create an ambience that constantly stimulates a creative thought, and therefore you can see some of the buildings established by Microsoft and so forth. I'm totally enviable of them when I see them in my recent visit in New York. So yes, totally appreciative of entrepreneurship, but there is an ecosystem. Do you then, once you've provided those opportunities, do you then provide for a sustainable entrepreneurial model outside the university system? Do you allow for it to multiply and compound and impact and so forth? What do you put in place And those are the things I think we need to start focusing on. Do you, or will we only focus on what is within our purview? So I keep reverting back to the ecosystem, because it's becoming very, very clear that when the students cry out for help, it's because they are stimulated to a certain point and then they don't know what to do. They either run out of funds or cannot access the right network to ensure that they expand on the innovation or ideas or focus. So it's looking beyond that. So one of the things, for example, that I think we really need to start thinking about on how we teach it at business schools, Morris, is networking. I've done so many courses at business school, and they'll tell you, this is networking is critical, but we all know it's network is sometimes 50% of the solution. Who how to access, funds for this and so forth. That entire network is sometimes absent in the work of the entrepreneurs. So, and how do you teach networking? All of those questions. Is there room for teaching the skills beyond networking? And so we found in a workshop that we attended last week that, in fact, South African students are lacking in communication skills as part of their curriculum. And you'll find that some of the universities in the north, when a student graduates, they are trained to sell their trade, and I wonder, shouldn't we be reviewing what we teach in certain aspects? So some of the skills, can we not add to release some of this frustration, so that self-expression must not be something that presents an obstacle to your launching your next product or innovation? So some of those questions I think we need to start reflecting on. There are various skills beyond the current academe that we need to start reconfiguring and building into the system.
Thanks. A brief comment before passing the ball to Morris. I think you put your finger on how do you teach networking, and for that matter, how do you teach leadership? How do you teach interpersonal skills? How do you teach management of partnerships? For that matter, how do you teach management? It's very difficult to teach those things to pre-experienced people. You can prepare the ground. There are formalities involved with understanding the concepts and maybe some of the techniques, but really a lot of those process skills, which involve wisdom, which involve nuanced strategic thinking, can only really be developed once people have some work stroke, life stroke, career stroke, sectoral experience, and hence the importance of mature or more mature adults coming back to higher education for MBAs or Masters of Management or professional development programs or executive programs, where their experience can be reflected on, can be intermingled and commingled with other people's experiences, where tacit, implicit knowledge can be surfaced by facilitation or by using the heuristics of presenting them with state-of-the-art models in various disciplines and sectors. And out of that collective conversation, not a banking theory of education, can come an exciting dynamic where indeed people can develop as networkers, as leaders, as communicators, as better managers. So it goes to what do we do at undergraduate level or at pre-experience level? How do we ease people initially into careers, into work environments, into early entrepreneurial? And I know there are exceptional people who do become entrepreneurs straight off the bat, and maybe who dropped out, like the Bill Gates in them, but they are not necessarily the norm. And then how do we develop further our capacity as higher education to be capacitating and empowering lifelong learning, whether it's with more formal degrees, with ongoing kinds of professional management leadership education, or simply uncertificated courses that people attend and learn, benefit, become state of the art, so that the intellectual circle, or maybe spiral, between practice and society and the economy and going through the prism of effective higher education institutions is speeded up, doesn't have to wait for 3 or 4 years in the full degree, and is accelerated. So I think that's implicit in the question. Yes, you can only do so much at the undergraduate level. You can format people, but people need to keep learning and keep going through the prism of effective learning and teaching and applied research experiences. I'll go over to you, Morris.
Thank you so much, Marcia and Patrick. So I've had the privilege of listening and looking at the question. So I've had an opportunity to frame my answer. And so I was taken back to my high school scientific method approach of decision making, which is what is the independent variable in the second question, and what is the dependent variable. So we know clearly the dependent variable here is unemployment rate, and the question is whether do you want high or low unemployment rate. But I think by suggesting that entrepreneurship is the answer, and please don't get me wrong, we teach a lot of entrepreneurship, but we don't do it to solve the problem of unemployment. We do it because it's a great idea to teach entrepreneurship. And so for me, I think what is required as leaders is to take a step back and to reflect as to what might be the independent variable that is causing a high unemployment rate, and ask yourself, what is the role of higher education in addressing that independent variable? So I suppose in a tongue-in-cheek way of responding, I find myself circling back to where Marcia is taking us, and I think she's been very kind in slapping me down about my overemphasizing STEM subjects ahead of others. I didn't do a STEM degree, by the way, Marcia. I did a law degree, and then I lost my path, ended up doing a business degree and PhD. But I started in the humanities, so just start there. And the point I'm trying to make is, actually, I think the real opportunity, and maybe starts tackling half of the previous question, the first question. And I think maybe here it's a question I'm going to throw at Marcia is, because we don't know what the jobs of the future will look like, it's hard for us to kind of train for those jobs or educate for those jobs at a content level. And this idea of saying people must finish their degrees in 3 years or 4 years in order to kind of qualify for government funding, in that context for me, seems a bit misguided. Because it might be better actually to have a different kind of degree. So instead of the name entrepreneurial, have a much more of an open degree, a transdisciplinary degree, where you have a student who doesn't belong to a particular discipline or a particular faculty, and the student who's not required to finish until they're ready to finish. And let's say, give them 10 years to finish. And in that space, the student kind of collects, and here I'm going against the question. It's not random, but does collect courses from the sciences, from humanities, from theology, from the mathematics, and kind of builds a transdisciplinary degree, because in that context, that person is solving for the skills of the future just in time as they need them, as they experience them. And I think if we want to be innovative and we want to have a dynamic educational system that is responsive to changes in the working environment, changes in the global environment. That might be an idea that we think about at a system level. We think about an open degree, a transdisciplinary degree, a faculty-less student. That's just kind of a thought for us to kind of mull over, maybe not here some other time. And so I think within that context, we're creating a much more empowering and more targeted and more effective graduate student, whether it's a pre-experience or a post-experience student. When it comes to a pipeline for influential research to benefit society and to commercialize, I think here there's an opportunity for universities to recognize that we create intellectual property all the time. And what we lack is an ability to generate value out of that. Because we currently are incentivized to pass students and graduate them. We're not incentivized, whether it's by government or ourselves, incentivized to say, how do we then generate value from this knowledge? So absolutely, what you describe as the contemporary university, what I describe as the future university, needs to think about the IP that it generates through its students and academics as a source of value that is trapped, it's latent value. And we need to find incentives, whether they're internal incentives within the university or system level incentives to encourage people to commercialize, socialize that value. And I'll stop right there. Thank you very much, Patrick.
Right, we've got about 6 minutes left, and then the room closes automatically. So I'm supposed to give some sort of summation, which may be challenging given the wide-ranging nature of the conversation. So I'm going to ask Marcia to go first, and maybe any kind of summation or sound bites you'd like to give in about 2 minutes. I'll come back to Morris. He kind of did summate, but I'll give him another chance. And then please leave me 2 minutes, otherwise I'll be in trouble with my principals for not having summed up at all. Marcia.
Thank you so much. I'll go back to the topic, and my departing shot is this. Institutions will do, as they have in the past, have an immense role to play in our society. How they are constituted matters, what they do matters, how they affect themselves in society matters. And of course, we will continue to invest in them to the extent that they remain relevant. And the way they remain relevant is by being responsive to the multiple needs of our society and enable us in many respects to build generations which will sustain the very same institutions and the institutions that support them. I'll end there.
Thanks. Morris.
Thank you, Patrick. Patrick, I'm going to maybe give you a headline that we can suffer two types of pain: a pain of regret or the pain of discipline. And I think if we stay the same, we will suffer the pain of regret. But if we recognize how fast the world is changing and how fast we need to change, in other words, our rate of learning needs to exceed the rate of change in order for us to be relevant. And we need to have discipline to do that. And I think we'll do well. And we do need these kinds of partnerships to enable us to rather suffer the pain of discipline as opposed to the pain of regret. Thank you very much, Patrick.
I'm ad idem with that. And for me to summate, just to say that it may seem that I allowed the conversation to somewhat stray from strictly partnerships involved with management or leadership capacity building. But I think I did it deliberately and hopefully strategically, because unless we understand the terrain in which this conversation took place and the scope and priorities of the challenge, and unless we are able to frame it in the way that Morris just did, we will not know what our management and leadership development partnerships should be about, what methodology, approach, culture, and values they should have, and what urgency and determination and dedication we should tackle them with. Because I think what we did in certainly the latter part of the discussion is we defined the terrain which is going to inform and is going to shape the nature of those leadership development partnerships and the nature of that leadership development itself, that we need to urgently take forward, because the society, the country, and maybe many other global jurisdictions are awaiting that kind of leadership direction through the apparent fog and haze of 21st century society. We need to get up, get energetic, get applied, and be disciplined so that we will not have to suffer those regrets. Thank you all. I hope people enjoyed the conversation in whole or in part. No doubt some of these themes are going to run and run and run, and I'm sure we're going to come back to some of them, hopefully in more developed form, and maybe with case studies when we do the HELM Summit 2023. Thank you to my articulate and enthusiastic panelists, without which this could not have happened in the way it did. Thank you all.